The guard at the prison checkpoint looked at the visitor log and paused, glancing up at the older man standing in front of him with quiet confusion. 61st visit, the guard said slowly. You've been coming here every single month for 5 years. Robert nodded, saying nothing, signing his name on the log exactly as he had 60 times before. The guard hesitated before buzzing him through, unable to stop himself from asking the question every new officer eventually asked once they noticed the pattern. Can I ask who you're visiting? Robert's jaw tightened slightly. The man who killed my son. The guard's eyes widened, clearly unprepared for that answer. Then why do you keep coming back? Robert stood there for a long moment, staring down the gray hallway that led toward the visitation room, toward a man he had once wanted dead with every fiber of his being. Because hating him wasn't bringing my son back, Robert finally said. And I got tired of being the only person left standing in the wreckage. What happened over those 5 years of visits was about to prove that some of the deepest forgiveness in the world doesn't erase grief. It transforms it into something neither man ever expected. Welcome to Digital Story Corner. Sit back, relax, and let's begin. Robert Hale had been an ordinary father for 22 years, raising his only son Michael in a small house on a quiet street, coaching his Little League team, teaching him to drive in an empty parking lot on Sunday mornings, watching him grow into a young man who had just been accepted into engineering school on a partial scholarship. Michael was, by every account, a good kid, the kind of son who called his mother every week without being asked, who still hugged his father goodbye even in front of his college friends. He had spent that entire last summer working weekends at the hardware store to save up for a used car, proud of every dollar he earned toward it. And Robert remembered teasing him gently about how carefully he vacuumed the interior every single Sunday. On a rainy October night, Michael was driving home from a study group when a car crossed the center line and struck him head-on. He died before the ambulance even arrived. The driver of the other car, a 24-year-old man named Daniel, survived the crash with only minor injuries. His blood alcohol level was nearly 3 times the legal limit. Robert remembered almost nothing about the weeks that followed, existing in a fog of grief so total it felt like drowning in slow motion. He remembered his wife screaming when the police officers came to their door. He remembered planning a funeral for a son who had been perfectly healthy exactly 1 week earlier. He remembered sitting in a courtroom months later, staring at Daniel across the room, consumed by a hatred so complete it frightened him. Daniel was sentenced to 8 years for vehicular manslaughter. Robert sat through every single day of that trial, and on the final day, when Daniel was led away in handcuffs, Robert felt nothing that resembled satisfaction, only a deeper, hollower emptiness than before, because no sentence, however long, was ever going to give him back his son. For the first year after the trial, Robert's grief calcified into a rage he carried everywhere, unable to speak Daniel's name without his hands beginning to shake. His wife, Carol, grieved differently, quieter, turning inward, and the distance between them grew as they each drowned separately in the same unbearable loss. Robert stopped attending church. He stopped returning calls from friends who no longer knew what to say to him. He quit his job as a construction foreman after snapping at a young apprentice over a mistake that reminded him, unfairly, of his own son's age. He spent most nights sitting alone in Michael's old room, surrounded by trophies and photographs, unable to accept that this was simply what the rest of his life would now look like. It was Michael's old football coach, a man Robert had known for over a decade, who finally said something that cracked through the wall Robert had built around himself. Sitting together at a diner nearly 18 months after the accident, watching Robert push scrambled eggs around his plate without eating a single bite, the coach told Robert gently that he was watching him disappear, piece by piece, into a grief that was consuming the very qualities that had made him such a good father in the first place. He didn't tell Robert to forgive Daniel. He simply asked him one quiet question. What would Michael want you to do with the rest of your life? That question haunted Robert for months afterward. He knew, somewhere beneath the rage, that his son had been a genuinely kind young man, the type who once spent an entire afternoon helping a stranded stranger fix a flat tire on the highway, simply because it was the right thing to do. Robert began to wonder, painfully, whether the man his son had been would recognize the man his father was becoming. Nearly 2 years after the accident, almost without fully deciding to, Robert submitted a formal request to visit Daniel in prison. He told himself, driving there for the first time, that he simply wanted Daniel to see, up close, exactly what he had destroyed. He wanted to make sure Daniel understood the full weight of what one reckless decision had taken from an entire family. That first visit was almost unbearable. Daniel, thin and hollow-eyed, could barely look at him directly, apologizing over and over in a voice that cracked with a guilt that seemed to have no bottom. Robert left that first visit shaking, uncertain whether he had accomplished anything at all, uncertain whether he even wanted to return. But something about Daniel's face stayed with him on the drive home, a specific, haunted emptiness that Robert recognized immediately, because he saw the exact same emptiness every single morning in his own bathroom mirror. He learned, through the prison chaplain a few months later, a detail that changed the entire direction of his visits. Daniel had grown up in foster care, aged out of the system with no family to speak of, and in the 5 years since his sentencing, Robert had been his only visitor of any kind. The chaplain mentioned, carefully, that Daniel had recently been placed on suicide watch after a failed attempt, overwhelmed by a guilt he had no tools and no support system to process. Robert sat in his car outside the prison for nearly an hour after hearing that news, wrestling with something he didn't fully understand yet. Some part of him, the part still capable of recognizing another human being's suffering, even through his own, understood that a young man was quietly dying in that prison from the exact same grief that had nearly swallowed Robert whole. And nobody in the entire world was showing up for him. Robert began visiting monthly after that, no longer driven by anger, but by something far more complicated. He never once told Daniel he forgave him, not in those early years, because the truth was, he wasn't entirely certain that he did. But he kept showing up anyway, bringing books, talking about ordinary things, teaching Daniel, who had barely finished high school, how to study for his GED behind those prison walls. Some visits they barely spoke at all, simply sitting across from each other in silence that no longer felt entirely hostile. Two men connected by the worst night of both their lives, slowly learning how to exist in the same room without that night swallowing everything else whole. Over the following years, their relationship became something neither man could have predicted. Robert watched Daniel slowly rebuild pieces of himself, watched him earn his GED, then begin taking correspondence courses in counseling, driven by a determination to eventually help other young people avoid the mistake that had cost Michael his life and cost Daniel his own future. It was during their 4th year of visits that Robert finally said the words out loud, sitting across from Daniel in that same gray visitation room. He told him he forgave him, not because Daniel deserved it, not because it erased anything that had happened, but because Robert had finally understood that carrying hatred for the rest of his life would only guarantee that Daniel's one terrible decision destroyed 2 lives completely, instead of just one. Daniel wept for nearly 10 minutes straight, unable to speak, before finally telling Robert that not a single day passed in prison where he didn't think about Michael, where he didn't wish desperately that he could somehow trade places with him. Daniel was released on parole after serving 6 years of his 8-year sentence, credited for good behavior and genuine rehabilitation. Robert was the only person waiting for him outside those gates, holding a small duffel bag of donated clothes and a bus ticket, standing in a parking lot neither of them ever imagined they would share a moment in together. Today, Robert and Daniel travel together to high schools across the state, sharing their story with teenagers about the devastating consequences of drunk driving. Robert speaks about his son's life and the immeasurable weight of losing him. Daniel speaks about the decision that destroyed his own future and ended another young man's completely, and about the terrifying reality of what unearned forgiveness can look like when someone chooses to offer it anyway. Students often sit in complete silence by the end of their talks, several of them approaching afterward simply to shake Robert's hand, unable to fully articulate what they had just witnessed. Robert still visits Michael's grave every single Sunday, exactly as he always has. But now, once a month, Daniel comes with him, standing quietly, a respectful distance away, offering his own private apology to a young man he never got the chance to properly know. Robert says now that forgiveness never once brought his son back, and it never will. But it did something else, something he never expected it could. It kept one more young life from being lost entirely to the same tragedy. And somewhere in that unlikely, complicated redemption, Robert finally found a way to carry his grief without it completely destroying everything good that remained inside him. If this story moved you, subscribe to Digital Story Corner and hit the bell. A brand new story drops every single day.